to actively click. All right, good morning or afternoon or evening to all of you. We'll get started in just a few minutes here. Just wait for a few others to join. All right, I see that some are still trickling in here, but I think we'll get started. I want to welcome you all on behalf of the World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defense Fund, and the Oeko-Institut. We're really excited today to launch the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative Scoring Tool. I'm Brad Schallert. I work at WWF-US and help co-found the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative. And I'll be the host of the webinar for today. So a bit of context before we start here. In 2021, the voluntary carbon market exceeded $1 billion for the first time. As these markets grow, the environmental integrity of the credits being transacted must not be compromised, though, if they are to contribute to the goals of the Paris Agreement. But in past evidence has shown that carbon credits being sold on the market are not all at the same level of quality. They don't have the same climate mitigation impact and sort of other environmental and social co-benefits. Credit buyers have difficulty in identifying still, even after years of the markets being, being out there, to identify which credits are of high quality. So this is why CCQI, or Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, was created. Before we get going here, I'll introduce the other speakers who will be joining me today. So there I am. We also have Pedro Barada, Senior Climate Director at Environmental Defense Fund, and Dr. Lambert Schneider, who is Research Coordinator for International Climate Policy at the Oeko-Institut. So to guide you through our agenda here, we'll first start out with Pedro talking about, in a bit more detail, about CCQI. We'll then jump to Lambert, who will talk about our approach, our methodology, the detailed assessments we've been doing over this past several months, and some findings from those assessments. And then I'll walk through the tools and methodology, tools and the main resources we're talking about today, the scoring tool, which is available on the CCQI website. And then finally, I'll outline the next steps for CCQI, and then there'll be a small period of Q&A. So we hope to wrap up by the top of the hour here. As we're going through the presentation, just a little bit of housekeeping, please feel free to post your questions by clicking on the Q&A button in the Zoom here. We'll try to answer these on an ongoing basis through the presentation. We may opt to leave some of them towards to talk about at the end of the presentation. But there's not going to be a chat function. There's just the Q&A function you should be finding. So yeah, please submit questions in the session or wait to the end if you'd like. But with that, I will turn it over to Pedro to explain more about CCQI. Pedro. And you're on mute, Pedro, just so you know.
Sorry, years into pandemic and we still do this. Thank you, Brad. So let's start with our mission, CCQI's mission, which is basically to provide transparent information on the quality of carbon credits and to enhance the quality of carbon credits overall. The idea is that we provide transparent information that will enable users to identify carbon credits that deliver mitigation climate change and offer co-benefits and overall enhance the quality of carbon credits in the market. So why are we doing this as three independent organizations? We see that carbon markets, as Brad has mentioned, are facing a resurgence. We've seen volumes go very quickly up in the last year, but we're also seeing the mixed quality of carbon credits that are currently transacted. And with that mixed quality comes a reputational risk for buyers if the emission reductions that attach to the carbon credits are not credible. So what we need is to enhance the integrity of carbon credits, and to do so, encourage carbon crediting programs, project developers, and other market participants to pursue the highest standards available in the market. How we do that is through independent, user-friendly scorings to assess the quality of carbon credits. And the stress here is on both independent and user-friendly, as we want to assist buyers in navigating this complicated, let's say, sea of information on carbon credits right now. So to whom is this addressed? Eventually, everyone who has a stake in the carbon crediting market and carbon crediting world. So countries in their procurement programs, companies, investors, individuals even. Next slide. So what makes us unique from other initiatives that are also out there rating or scoring carbon credits? We're not funded by revenues related to carbon credits, i.e. nobody's paying us as a rating agency in any way. The experts that we have employed, they're not employed by project developers or carbon crediting programs. We score credits on an interval scale and not on a binary basis, i.e. not a pass-fail scale. This is important since some initiatives are specifically designed to attach some kind of tag onto the credits. Here, the focus is on presenting as much and as more reliable information as possible. Our methodology and our assessment documents are, as of today, transparent and publicly available. And we do not provide a service for a fee in terms of carbon crediting rating. We rate carbon programs and their methodologies, but we rate them following our own prioritization of work and not for a fee for any particular client. Next slide. So where are we in terms of the development of CCQI? In phase one, we developed detailed criteria for assessing carbon credit quality, and we validated that with stakeholder consultation. Phase two, which took quite some time last year, we developed a robust methodology for applying criteria. And again, we validated that with stakeholder consultation. We're now at the end of stage three and beginning of phase four. In phase three, we've developed this demo application of scorings, which will be shown today alongside the web interface. And we've selected already a number of combinations of project type, crediting program, and host countries. And based on that, let's say, demonstration phase, we have then updated our methodology. And we're now going on to the phase four, where we'll be conducting ongoing assessments and publishing scores. I will be coming back later in the session to tell you about next steps. So I think with this, we can move on to the meat of the presentation with Lambert Schneider's presentation on our approach to scoring carbon credit quality.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pedro. So I will explain our quality objectives and methodology. So we have in total 19 criteria for assessing quality, many sub-criteria, and we group these in 7 quality objectives, which are illustrated here. So the first one we called robust determination of the greenhouse gas emissions impact. That includes, for example, additionality and the methodological approaches to quantify emission reductions. We have avoiding double counting, addressing non-permanence, facilitating transition towards net zero emissions. This refers to the question, what type of technology or practice is involved, whether that has a lock-in risk or whether that really facilitates transition towards net zero emissions. We also assessed the institutional arrangements and processes of the carbon crediting programs, such as their governance, their transparency, and third-party auditing provisions. And then we have environmental and social impacts. So this is not related to greenhouse gas emission reductions, but to other impacts projects may have. And here we have assessed environmental and social safeguards of programs, whether they have them in place and how robust they are, and also what the typical expected impacts of different types of activities are in terms of environmental and social impacts. And lastly, we have a criterion which is about host country ambition, where we kind of look at how ambitious the NDC is and whether the country has a long-term target. And here the idea is this would apply to carbon credits which are backed by corresponding adjustments, so which are under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, where an ambitious target by the host country provides incentives for the host country to only authorize credits that are truly additional and where emission reductions are not overestimated. So this is more a safeguard criterion, one could say. So here's then how we have criteria and sub-criteria. This is an example for the first quality objective, robust determination of the greenhouse gas emissions impact. As I said, key criteria here are additionality and quantification of emission reductions, and in some cases where carbon markets have collapsed, also vulnerability. And then under each criterion, we have several sub-criteria. So for example, on additionality, we assess how the carbon crediting program assesses whether mitigation activity is required by laws and regulations. We look at the typical financial attractiveness of different type of mitigation activities or at their barriers. We also look at what provisions carbon crediting programs have in terms of requiring a notification by project developers that they seek carbon credits, or limitations on how long you can still register a project after it has started. So this is an example for one of the quality objectives, how we divide in criteria and sub-criteria. And in some instances, under each sub-criterion, we then have even many different indicators. So overall, it's hundreds of indicators which we evaluate in our methodology. So as Pedro stated, we don't have a threshold standard where we say this carbon credit is good and this carbon credit is bad. Rather, what we want to do is to provide users a nuanced picture of different quality features, how carbon credits perform against the different quality objectives. And we do so with a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 indicates that there's a very high confidence that the assessment criterion is met, and very low means that there's a very low confidence that it's met, and then we have scores in between. And then this is an example how the scores are being built. So then we score the different sub-criteria. For example, here in the first line on legal requirements, there's a score of 5, on financial attractiveness, a score of 4. And then there's this prior consideration, or what I referred earlier as notification of intent. And together then that, for example, could give a score of 4 on additionality. And then maybe on robust quantification, the score is 3. And then we have a system which we call inverse weighing. And that means that to get a high score, a program needs to perform in all criteria well. So here, for example, if you have a 4 in additionality and a 3 in robust quantification, the overall score may only be a 3. And the thinking behind that is to really perform well, you need to ensure both additionality and robust quantification, and one cannot make up for the other. And therefore, we use this, what we call inverse weighing. What is important to understand about our initiative is that we do not assess individual carbon credits or individual projects, but we assess different types of carbon credits. And what is a type of carbon credit? That's characterized by different features. First of all, it's kind of what type of project it is. For example, a landfill gas utilization project or an efficient cook stove project. Then under which carbon crediting program is this project registered? For example, the verified carbon standard. Then another important question is which quantification methodology is applied, because that has a big influence on robust quantification, of course, and sometimes there are different methodologies that can be used under a certain program or different tools. And then also in what host country is the project implemented. Sometimes carbon crediting programs have different rules, for example, for LDCs, for least developed countries, or for developed countries, etc. And then another question is whether the carbon credit is authorized for use under Article 6 and then backed by corresponding adjustments and not. And so all these features together, they make up a type of carbon credit. And then we try to assess the typical impacts. But of course, individual projects can differ from these outcomes. And therefore, it's important when using this tool to also look at other features of individual projects and not only rely on our scores. So currently, as Pedro has highlighted, we have a demo application. So we have applied this to the 4 biggest carbon crediting programs in terms of historic volume. These are the Clean Development Mechanism, the Gold Standard, the Verified Carbon Standard, and the Climate Action Reserve. And we have assessed 3 project types: establishment of natural forest, afforestation, landfill gas utilization, and efficient cook stoves. And we have in total assessed 7 different methodologies. And then we have assessed in particular 10 host countries with regard to host country ambition, but the tool can also be used for other countries. It's just that for these countries, you get some more information. So how and by whom should the scores be used? As I already said, it's the scores represent expected quality, or you could also say they may give you warnings where you may need to look in particular. But it's important that additional due diligence is conducted on individual projects before making purchase decisions. And so we are targeting different stakeholders. We are mainly, of course, targeting buyers, which can get a nuanced picture of carbon credit quality, and they can understand what are the particular risks of specific types of carbon credits or projects. Of course, we are also targeting in some way the carbon crediting programs. They can see, okay, in which areas do we score well, in which areas do we not score so well, how may we improve our own program rules, and also looking at how have our peers resolved some of the issues. And lastly, of course, it can also inform project developers who may also look, okay, what areas are particularly tricky if I register under this program, or how can I design my project to safeguard against certain risks. Thank you. So now I will turn to key findings from the scoring exercise. So overall, what we found is a quite mixed quality of carbon credits. So what we often see is some carbon credits, they perform well, pretty well even in some areas sometimes, but then often poorly in others. So it's really a picture. If you go to our website, you will see that sometimes you see greens and reds. so scores of 5 and 1 for 1 carbon credit in different areas. And we observe a little bit something similar for carbon crediting programs, because also here we observe that sometimes a carbon crediting program performs very good in one area, but another program performs better in another area. So also here we don't observe that there's clearly one best program. Also, of course, we don't assess programs per se, but only the combination of projects, programs, host countries, etc. But also here we see a mixed picture. And for us, that was also quite interesting. And we think that if, because some programs have really good rules in nearly every area. And so if carbon crediting programs would adopt the best practices from their peers in the areas where they may not have so good scores, and other peers copy their provisions where they have good scores, I think it would be an important step forward in overall quality of carbon credits. So here are some examples of where we identified differences among carbon crediting programs. So for example, this requirement, which I mentioned before, consideration of legal requirements, so that you assess whether the project is legally requirement. So in some constellations, depending also which methodology you use, there's no check at all. For some programs or some type of carbon credits, there's a check at the project start and at the renewal of the crediting period. But there are also some provisions of carbon crediting programs where this needs to be checked at each issuance. So there's quite a difference in provisions. Same, and we'll get to that in the next slide, there's a wide range of time periods for how long any reversals need to be monitored and compensated for. There are differences in notification of intent. So some programs allow retroactive crediting so that you can register projects which were implemented in the past, and others require that in such instances, the projects need to notify the program that they seek credits. Also, for example, for avoiding double counting, we see differences in the Article 6 readiness, but also in simple things, or well, maybe they're not so simple, but in how carbon crediting programs address double use, for example. What type of information needs to be provided when a cancellation for a certain use is made, or how carbon crediting programs address indirect overlaps in projects so that the same emission reductions may be counted twice. And then in the end, there are large differences also in how environmental and social safeguards are provided. So some programs have very thorough rules, others have nearly no rules. Of course, it's also important to note that these programs operate in different countries, etc. So it's always up to the user to also consider, okay, how big is the risk here, and how much do I need to take that into account for a specific project type or a specific country. So here I dive quickly into some of the findings. So for example, I mentioned this minimum period to monitor reversals to address non-permanence. The Climate Action Reserve, for example, requires the longest period, this for 100 years. Gold Standard requires this for 50 years. And with the VCS, depending on how the crediting period is chosen, in some instances, this may only be guaranteed for 20 years. And accordingly, we score here differently. Maybe you may question, okay, why has 100 years only a score of 4 and not 5? The reason here is that compared to carbon credits, which do not have a non-permanence risk, these we score as 5. And once you have a non-permanence risk, you can address it quite well, but you can never address it perfectly. So you still have that risk, and therefore the highest score on addressing non-permanence for carbon credits where you have reversal risks is 4 in our methodology. So here I will not go into the details in terms of institutional arrangements and processes. What's interesting here is also that it's a mixed picture. So it's not that one program performs well in all areas, but that there are really differences in programs. For example, in third-party auditing, we looked at how much oversight is there on auditors? Is the accreditation body informed about shortcomings systematically? Are there sanctions in place? for auditors if they do not perform well. And that's, for example, an area where programs deferred. Next slide. Here, another example, quantification methodologies. As I said, we evaluated 7 quantification methodologies in total. And also here, we found quite some difference. So how did we do that? So we really went with several experts, not just one expert, through the methodologies. We systematically identified risk of overestimation. So which factors in the methodology may constitute a risk for overestimation and which elements may have potential for underestimation. And then we identified these factors, and then at the end, we kind of tried to sum them up, although this, of course, cannot always be done quantitatively, but we tried to see the overall picture based on all these factors which we have evaluated. Is it conservative, the quantification, meaning that it tends towards underestimating, or is it accurate, or is there a risk of overestimating? And so, for example, here 2 examples: the CAR, Climate Action Reserve landfill gas protocol, we deem to be pretty conservative, for example, because some emission sources are omitted and not accounted, which these projects also reduce. But then, for example, for the CDM cook stove methodologies, we found indication based on literature that there may be factors which are systematically overestimated, and therefore we identified a significant risk of overestimation, and accordingly the score is only a 1. Okay, this is the run through the key findings, and I hand back over to Brett to introduce our tools and resources. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lambert. And before we get to the Q&A here, talk about tools and resources and sort of what next steps are for CCQI. So our main tool, which we'll highlight in just a second here, I'll give a walkthrough of, is our interactive scoring tool. There's different ways you can access it from the website when you get there. There's also, however, a downloadable version of the scoring tool, which can be used by really advanced users who want to really understand how the tool is built, and even if they want to customize it and tweak it in a few ways. The other resource we have is our full methodology. You can really see how we've done our assessment, and then our assessment sheets that we have thus far for the project types, the programs, countries, methodologies, right? Those are available on the website too. So you can really see our rationale for, why we scored all of those things in the way that we have. Right now, I'll do a walkthrough of our tool here. So first, when you get to the website, you can go to score my carbon credit. You can see these drop-down menus. You can put in the project type. So here we'll select landfill gas utilization. Then you go down and select the program. We'll select climate action reserve here. And then there'll be drop down for the country. And in this case, only the US applies. So look at when the emission reduction removal occurred, and then there's a methodology. And from there, you'll be able to see this high-level overview. And then you'll be able to click through to see the detail behind the quality objectives, so the criteria and the sub-criteria. And just a note about when you see the term NR or NA, so not relevant is NR, so that means it just doesn't make sense to assess that. And then NA means not applicable, so it just was not assessed because of a lack of resources, for example, to be able to do that assessment at this time. So, but looking ahead to what's next for CCQI, we'll be spending a lot of time assessing new project types. So on our list of priorities are large-scale grid-connected solar power, large-scale grid-connected wind power, avoidance of methane emissions from oil and gas flaring, avoidance of methane from leaks in natural gas pipelines, and then finally, livestock manure management. We'll be adding one more additional crediting program to the mix. We did not have the ability to assess American Carbon Registry, and they're a big player in the market, so we want to move to them next. And so the relevant project types that we've assessed for CAR, Gold Standard, CDM, Vera, we'll be assessing those relevant to ACR as well. We'll also be adding 2 complementary standards to our assessment run by Vera. Beyond this, these assessments, which we'll be doing throughout 2022, we're hoping to present additional insights that we've gotten from our scorings, and be discussing the findings with buyers and hoping to partner with additional stakeholders to really ensure the scale of CCQI's impact. So please feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in chatting. But right now we're going to move to Q&A. So we've been getting quite a few questions within not the chat, but in the Q&A section here. Some have been answered, others we've not been able to get to. I guess I'm seeing a trend in some questions with regard to the sort of environmental and social co-benefits. There's a question about biodiversity and how that is assessed in particular, and gender as well. So I'm wondering if, Lambert, if you want to sort of give an overview of how we look at environmental and social safeguards within the methodology.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. So indeed, gender and biodiversity is assessed as part of assessing environmental and social impacts, that quality objective. And there we have 3 criteria. One is what environmental and social safeguards the carbon crediting program has in place. And in that we have about 40 indicators. So in these 40 indicators, we look, for example, how is stakeholder consultation being conducted? Is there a grievance mechanism in place? What type of safeguards does the program have? And as part of these safeguards, we also look at whether the carbon crediting program has kind of a gender policy, whether it requires to particularly address biodiversity. So these are several of the indicators of the 40 indicators which address this. And then we have kind of point system. So we kind of, for each indicator, if you fulfill that, you can get a point, 1 point, and then this adds up to around 40 points. And based on that, then we provide a score. Of course, one can always argue that some indicators are more important than others. And we had this discussion within the team. And in the end, because that's so difficult to judge, we kind of use the same 1 point score, I think, for nearly all of them, maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions. So this is how this works. And maybe again, what's important is what we assess here is the environmental and social safeguards of the program, right? It doesn't tell you whether an individual project is particularly good on biodiversity or not, right? So because, for example, for afforestation projects, the biodiversity impacts are so specific, that's not something our scoring can cover. So what our scoring covers is whether the program addresses, has robust safeguards in terms of biodiversity, but it's hard to tell what the individual project does. So that's the reason why some further due diligence is useful for these type of matters.
Yeah, thanks, Lambert. So just on the theme of sort of the level of assessment that we do within CCQI, we don't assess at the individual project level. I'm seeing a few questions around this theme. So I'm wondering, Pedro, if you can sort of explain why we don't do those individual project assessments, and sort of, yeah, I guess what we're sort of in a way missing, but you know, how do we think about that within CCQI and sort of the usefulness of this specific tool, right? If we're not looking at an individual project, can you say more about that?
Yes, glad to, Brett. So we do not assess, in fact, at individual project level. There's several reasons for it. One most obvious one would be just the sheer lack of capacity, given the enormous amount of projects out there. But also, let's say the scope of what we're trying to do is really we're trying to put forward a methodology that assesses at a, as Lambert was saying, a combination of carbon program and project methodology and country level, so that a buyer can go to us to our side and check a generic sort of rating for that type of project, that combination of projects. Nothing that what we do here is going to detract, let's say, from the need for that buyer or for that user to perform due diligence on individual projects, because we simply cannot have the bandwidth to do that, and it's still the buyer's responsibility to do that. We still think that even at this level, we provide quite some value added for screening, put it this way, how different methodologies are addressing different issues. The insights that Lambert has already provided with respect to this limited number of methodologies and combinations that we've done already tell us that. So I think the idea here is that this is very much focused not as a service to buyers in the sense of us, assisting in their due diligence all throughout at project level, but as an information point that buyers can use and can rely on.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and there's another question that was asked about how where we see CCQI versus ICVCM, VCMI, SBTI, other acronyms, Silvera and Pachama, right? And so CCQI is really at that, that one of many tools that a buyer can use, and it's accessible to anyone, right? Not just the buyers who have funds to pay for the individual project type due diligence. But there are others out there like Silvera, Pachama, Calyx, others beyond those three that are able to do this individual project type assessment. And so in combination with CCQI, that could be quite powerful. And ICVCM, I think we mentioned them earlier, that's more trying to provide a sort of a good bad threshold. VCMI is developing claims guidance, so that's not quite the same. And actually there's a little bit of overlap in what VCMI is developing with SBTI, arguably, and that it's in some ways sort of a leadership, like a target setting guidance that will be coming out. And SBTI, it's sort of tangentially related to carbon credits, but that's a sort of a leadership, target setting platform. So just to redouble on that question that I saw come through. So there are some questions about RED Plus and actually a lot of other specific project methodologies. So I think it's maybe some of those questions were asked before we made it through the full presentation, but we've not assessed every project type. Our methodology is likely to be able to handle most project types, but we've talked about in the team that to assess project-based RED or jurisdictional scale RED, we would have to take a look at the methodology to see if it's up for assessing those project types, because they're quite complex. There was a question about, I think from Chris Zink, about sort of the, engagement with Indigenous peoples and sort of, the scale of a project, and that specifically is not really answered within our methodology at this time. So that's just responding to sort of a few questions I'm seeing here. And yes, we would like to move to more nature-based projects in the future, but those are not on our list at the moment, at least for 2022. But we are looking at a 2023 list of projects here. So I see a question from Sam here on how often do we anticipate the underlying scores, how often do we anticipate updating the scores in the methodology, as standards will evolve over time. So I'm wondering if Lambert, you want to take that and reflect some of the conversations that we've had within CCQI about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good question. So we are now already at version 3 of the methodology, and we also had version 0.1. So actually it's the 4th version. And what we see is really that when you apply the methodology, you learn and you discover, okay, here's another program which uses a completely new approach, which we haven't considered. And so we haven't planned an update of the methodology this year because we are just releasing a new version today, the version 3.0. But for sure, we want to learn, and we also encourage you to reach out to us with recommendations for how to improve the methodology. And at some point, we will update that. I think the other issue is that currently our assessments are based on where the carbon crediting programs and methodologies stood mid last year, right? Because at some point we needed to cut off at a certain point and then do our evaluation. So we are aware that some carbon crediting programs have recently, very recently updated their rules. And of course, our scores do not yet reflect that always. So when there's also transparency on it, like we make very explicit in our assessment sheets, but also in the scoring tool, like to which versions of methodologies, for example, we refer. And of course, we need to see the updates which are necessary. So we will update over time, but it's also important to expand our scope, right, to make it more applicable. So we will need to balance our resources and capacity in that regard. But of course, it's planned to update our scores from time to time to reflect new developments by carbon crediting standards, but also to update our methodology time by time based on feedback, based on lessons learned, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So we'll go to Pedro in just a second to talk a little bit more about our business model for CCQI. But before I do that, I see a theme within the questions here about whether we're going to assess or whether what happens when projects are not registered in under a large carbon crediting program like the Gold Standard or Vera or something like that. Because there are a lot of credits that are coming onto the market now that are not going through the registry. So what do we think about that as CCQI? I think that the team generally feels that carbon crediting standards have a major role to play in assuring quality, right? And so I think with we're not assessing the credits that are out there that are not going through the methodologies, and so I think some might say that it's a little bit unfair to the standards that we're assessing them and not some that are kind of going through a backdoor here. And so I think we would say that, again, the standards serve a role for improving quality in the market, and it is probably best for buyers to look at credits that go through those standards because you get that additional assurance, right, that it's been reviewed and that it's been verified. It doesn't mean entirely that you can't have a credit that's good if it doesn't go through a registry, but an established registry, but it really does provide that additional assurance. And we're not assessing at the moment these newer registries. So Regen, for example, was mentioned, or Nori. These are sort of crypto-based registries. We've not got to those yet, but it is fair game in the future to look at those, I think. And so maybe to you, and then I guess, yeah, Lambert, you're saying that we looked at the largest programs first to ensure that we have as much coverage as possible. So a lot of our decision making in what we've assessed is based on getting as many credits in the market assessed as possible. So this is one of the reasons why we're moving on to large scale wind and large scale solar, because there's just a lot of those credits out there in the market. Yeah, Pedro, so you want to talk a little bit about our business model here and how we're funded, et cetera?
Yes, so there are a few questions about, the expansion of our work and the business model. So where do we get our funding from? since we mentioned that we do not operate on a fee basis. Just to be clear, we're fully funded from philanthropic sources at this stage, and we continue to do so. And our expectation is that we will be able to continue to do this solely on the basis of philanthropy for the next year and a half, as we try to expand, or as we expand the range of methodologies. And as mentioned in the presentation, we have already decided which methodologies to expand to in 2022, and we're considering several options for expansion further in 2023. These may or may not include some of the many requests here for in the Q&A for nature-based, tech-based, etc. Also, separate discussions ongoing, also for instance on jurisdictional red, etc., etc. So no decisions at this stage, partly because of just the rush to the lot of work that has gone into this particular phase, and the fact that we have quite a lot of work on our plates until the end of the year. But yes, that's the purpose. And just to complement that also with this discussion about how do we fare against other rating agencies or rating initiatives, and whether do we see ourselves in competition? To be absolutely clear, this is an NGO-led work. It is meant to facilitate the improvement of quality overall. If it is useful for any other rating agencies or any other efforts, so be it. It is truly meant as almost, if you want, a public good, and that's the business model in it, right?
Yeah.
So no, we're not in this to develop any particular fee basis at this stage.
Yeah, that's a great point. That, and we have we acknowledge that some of the startups that are looking at carbon credit quality and doing these sort of individual assessments at the individual project level, have looked at this methodology and are incorporating it into their thinking, and that is a win for us, right? We want to see like the methodology and the ideas adopted across the market. It doesn't need to just stay within the confines of the CCQI itself. Yes, and so I guess a question I'm seeing here on what we will do in terms of adding additional countries to the assessment. So for example, Mauricio here is asking about Turkey, when that would be included. Can you say more about that, Lambert?
Yeah, at the moment we have decided not to expand countries in 2022, basically for two reasons. And one is that only very few of our criteria depend on a country evaluation. It's mostly this criterion 7 about host country ambition, right? And so the scoring tool works quite well. You can apply it now to all countries, basically. You just don't get all criteria assessed, but it's very few which do not get assessed. And so it's kind of a question of prioritization of our resources, why we haven't planned that. And the second reason is where it may also play a role is the readiness to avoid double counting with NDCs in the double counting criteria, where we have a criterion which assesses have countries established institutional arrangements to authorize credits for Article 6, etc. But countries are not there yet, right? So the Article 6 rules were just adopted in Glasgow, and countries need more time to implement that. So at this stage, it doesn't make so much sense to evaluate countries against that criterion. And that's the reason why we currently haven't prioritized that.
Yeah, great. So questions about, a question about the potential for misinterpretation of the scores, right? So I'll just put this one live so others can see it. Because the scoring tool is assessing a generic credit in a sense, right? Given the different inputs to the scoring tool. So question about whether it could undermine existing projects or give a false sense, I'll just sort of adding to this question, or give a false sense that every project within a given category is good. So I'm wondering if maybe you want to take that first, Pedro, and then Lambert, if you want to add to that, to answering that question.
Well, whenever you put out something into the public domain, there's always the potential for misinterpretation. But I think we've tried to be clear that this is a tool. It is not by any chance, by any stretch of imagination, a recommended or a solely recommended tool by these organizations for your due diligence. So the questioner is partly right. What this should raise is issues of, if you see a bad score here on a particular criterion, you want to ask yourself, well, why is that? And is that relevant to my purchase? We also recognize that buyers have different individual purchasing requirements. Some buyers will have very high environmental, let's say a very high threshold in terms of what they want out of a particular credit on environmental social safeguards, but may not want as many assurances on other aspects, for example. So what this does is it provides the information, but we cannot say this enough. This is not about replacing any type of decision-making from the buyer's perspective. The buyer still, in our view, should be looking to do further due diligence, maybe even use some of these other tools that some people have mentioned, compare across. Ours is, I think, obviously, we think is a good tool, and it's a useful and fairly relevant one, but it should not be taken as the sole guide to purchase.
Yeah. Do you want to add your thoughts on this, Lambert?
Yeah, I think maybe 2 points. I think in particular, if a score is bad, it doesn't necessarily mean that the specific project in that area is necessarily bad, right? So I think a good example is if you have a project which has usually quite high social benefits, like cook stove projects, right? It could still appear on our score that this performs as a 1 on environmental and social safeguards, because you use a program which doesn't have any rules on it, but that doesn't mean that the specific project is bad. And so that's really, and we try to highlight that as good as we can on our website. We have an FAQ section where we provide this information. We say that below the scoring tool, but of course, there can always be misinterpretation. Maybe one other thought from my side. I think overall, personally, I think it's also important to understand that we are quite tough in our grading. So we want to be, right? And that's the purpose of the thing. So sometimes, yeah, you find a number of 1 scores overall, and that also has to do with the inverse weighing. Then if you feed into that, it's really worth opening the detailed findings, where then you see, okay, on additionality, this performs well. So I have a good chance that the project is additional, but maybe that quantification methodology is not so good. So that users understand, but that kind of leads to a low overall score. But you get the more nuanced picture if you zoom in the findings of the quality objectives. Maybe that's also important for users to understand.
Yeah. I think that in our communications, we try as much as we can to clarify that the results in the scoring tool are not representative of all credits that fit those inputs, right? But and another way that I've thought about this is that this might be a first stop for buyers, and then a buyer goes to a broker or someone selling them carbon credits and raises these scores, and then it might be more on the seller's plate to explain why they think that their credit is better than the benchmark that we're sort of applying within CCQI. So I think it's a way that sort of facilitates a conversation where we don't necessarily have that in all cases right now. So we're trying to arm buyers with more information and the right questions in a way, right? And something we've talked about within the CCQI team to sort of help translate these sort of the results of the assessment into questions, that due diligence questions that buyers could ask. But again, we have a lot on our plate this year, so that's not a promise to create that sort of due diligence questionnaire in a way, but yeah, that's sort of the dynamic I could foresee being set up here with these scores. So taking a look at the questions here. I'm not sure, Lambert or Pedro, if you see any specific questions in the Q&A, which only we're able to see, not all of the participants, that you want to pull from to respond to. Let me know if you do. We're about at the end here, so I would say we probably just have time for one more question to answer. And Pedro,
there was one from Frank Jordan. So, but I think we've partly covered it. This is about, will there be a competition between scoring bodies to establish theirs as the accepted standard? Just to make clear, we don't see ourselves necessarily in that competition. Obviously, what we want to do as NGOs is to establish let's say, a standard for quality and to push the carbon crediting programs to address any issues we see of quality with the methodologies, and provide guidance to buyers and to investors. We're very happy to see if it gets traction and use, but we don't see ourselves in competition. And as mentioned before, as a buyer, you have to not just avail yourself of this tool, but any other information, and there's plenty of information providers now in this space that can supplement or complement the information that we provide here.
Yeah, and I think just to wrap up, before I do the official wrap up, say that one of Lambert's messages within the key findings is that if carbon crediting programs adopted the best practices and approaches of their peers, that'd be a really important step forward. And not all of the programs scored in the same way in our methodology, so they could look to see how their competitors scored well and sort of update based on that, on those scores. But yeah, I mean, we're hoping that everyone within the carbon credit development value chain can benefit from this. Project developers too, who can look at how project types are scoring, how methodologies are scoring, and to sort of update their practices and how they implement, maybe change methodologies, maybe go beyond what a methodology requires, right? And then communicate that out to their buyers, and yes, and to us as well. We'd love to learn about best practices at the individual project level and project type level if we can. So thanks so much for all of your excellent questions. We'll be sending a follow-up email to with ones that we have not been able to answer in this session, because there's been quite a few. There's a lot of open questions. A lot of those we might try to consolidate into one answer. But yeah, we hope to do a follow-up. We'd just like to remind you all that the slides and the presentation will be posted to the CCQ website later. I'm not sure how quickly we'll be getting that up. We'll be getting up as soon as possible, though, probably in the next couple of days or so. And yeah, we just really appreciate you all joining us today. And please stay in touch. Please reach out to us with any questions. And we hope to have more scores and resources coming from CCQI over this next year. So thanks again, and thanks to my fellow panelists here, Lambert and Pedro. Hope you all have a good evening or rest of the day, wherever you are.
Thank you. Bye-bye.